The wire caught the late afternoon sun like a serrated knife, throwing shadows across red Oklahoma dirt. Inside the compound, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto stood motionless, his hands pressed flat against his thighs, waiting. He had been waiting for death since the morning they pulled him from the shattered remains of his foxhole on Saipan, 3 weeks and an ocean crossing ago. That he still breathed was an offense against everything he had been taught. In Japan, his name would already be stricken from the family register. His mother would have performed funeral rites for a son who no longer existed. The propaganda posters had been explicit. Americans flayed prisoners alive, mutilated them, and displayed their severed heads as trophies. Yet here he stood, alive, unmarked, and therefore more deeply wounded than any blade could accomplish. He had expected torture. He had braced for starvation. What he had not prepared for was the waiting itself, the excruciating suspension between the moment of capture and the inevitable execution. Each dawn, he woke up, startled that his heart still beat. Each night, sleep came reluctantly, heavy with the weight of dishonor. The shame was not abstract. It lived in his chest like a stone, pressing against his ribs with every breath. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Around him, 43 other Japanese soldiers existed in the same suspended state. Some had been captured on Tinian, others from the Marshall Islands, a few plucked from the water after their transport ship was torpedoed. They avoided each other's eyes, as if acknowledgement might compound the collective disgrace. In whispers, when the guards were distant, they spoke not of survival but of obligation. Several had tried to provoke the Americans into killing them, refusing orders, spitting at guards. The Americans had simply walked away. The camp itself was a contradiction. Barracks stood in neat rows, recently whitewashed, their tin roofs reflecting the brutal summer heat. Latrines had been dug with military precision. A small building near the entrance bore a red cross on its white-painted door. Medical supplies. The Americans seemed to care whether their prisoners lived or died, which made no sense whatsoever. A prisoner who expected death could accept it. A prisoner who received care faced a crueler fate, the obligation to continue existing in shame. Takeshi had served in the Imperial Japanese Army for 6 years, 3 of them on the Chinese mainland, 2 in the Pacific. He had memorized the Senjin-kun, the field service code issued in 1941. Its words were branded into his memory. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving a stain on your honor. He had recited those words before battle, drawing strength from their certainty. Honor was simple when death was the alternative. But now, standing behind American wire, he discovered honor was not simple at all. The propaganda had been relentless throughout his service. Films showed Allied soldiers bayoneting prisoners, photographs allegedly depicted torture chambers, radio broadcasts described unspeakable atrocities. Even the civilians back home believed it. To surrender was not merely to give up the fight. It was to choose degradation over dignity, torture over an honorable death. Takeshi had carried those certainties into battle like armor. They had made him brave. They had also made him unprepared for anything except death. The morning of his capture played endlessly in his mind. American Marines had overrun their position before dawn. Takeshi had fired until his ammunition was spent, then drawn his bayonet, prepared for the final charge. But the explosions had come too fast, shrapnel tearing through his leg, collapsing him into the mud. When he woke, he was being dragged across volcanic sand by 2 Americans who handled him with the impersonal efficiency of men moving cargo. He waited for the bullet. It never came. Instead, they carried him to a field hospital where a medic, a boy who looked barely old enough to shave, cleaned his wounds and injected him with something that dulled the pain. Takeshi had stared at the medic's face, searching for the cruelty the propaganda had promised. The boy's expression was tired, methodical, detached. He worked quickly, bandaged the leg, moved to the next wounded man. No torture, no brutality, just medical care delivered to an enemy who had, hours before, been trying to kill him. The dissonance had begun there, in that field hospital tent, with morphine dulling his pain and American voices murmuring around him. If they intended to kill him, why heal him first? If they sought to degrade him, why waste medicine? The questions gnawed at him, undermining the certainty that had sustained him through years of war. He tried to hold on to the old beliefs, to interpret this treatment as a prelude to worse horrors, but doubt, once planted, grew roots. The ship that brought them to America had been another contradiction. The hold was crowded, yes, and the air thick with the smell of too many men in too small a space. But they were given water twice daily, and food, thin soup and rice, meagre but regular. No beatings, no mockery. The American guards watched them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to indifference to thinly veiled hostility, but even the hostile ones followed orders. They did not strike. They did not starve. They simply guarded. Takeshi had spent the voyage trying to understand. He spoke to other prisoners in fragments, careful not to be overheard by the guards. Had anyone been tortured? No. Starved? Only during the sea battle, before capture. Beaten? A few men reported rough handling during the initial moments of surrender, but nothing since. The collective bewilderment was palpable. They had all expected to die. They had all been prepared for it. Instead, they were being transported like valuable cargo, kept alive for reasons none of them could fathom. When they arrived at the camp in Oklahoma, the confusion deepened. American officers inspected them, not with the gleeful cruelty of captors, but with bureaucratic detachment. Forms were filled out, names recorded, photographs taken. Takeshi stood before a camera, his face hollowed by weeks of poor rations, and stared into the lens. He felt like a ghost being catalogued. Prisoner number 9472, Sergeant. Imperial Japanese Army. I am 28 years old. Captured Saipan, June 15, 1944. The barracks they were assigned were Spartan, but functional. Wooden bunks lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. No torture devices, no cages, just beds. Takeshi lay on his bunk that first night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of men who should have been corpses. Someone wept quietly in the darkness. Someone else prayed. Takeshi said nothing. Prayer required hope, and hope felt like a betrayal of everything he had once believed. Days turned into a rhythm. Work details assigned, usually simple labor, clearing rocks from a field, repairing fences. Afternoon, return to the barracks, evening rations. The food was strange, thick bread instead of rice, canned vegetables, occasionally meat that tasted of salt and fat. It was more than they had eaten in the final weeks before capture, when Japanese supply lines were collapsing and soldiers survived on whatever they could forage. Takeshi ate mechanically, fueling a body he no longer wanted. The guards were a constant presence, but not an oppressive one. They carried rifles, yes, and patrolled the perimeter. But they did not enter the barracks with whips or chains. They shouted orders in English, which few prisoners understood, then repeated them with gestures. Sometimes a Japanese-American interpreter arrived, a Nisei, soldier whose presence felt like a living insult, a man of Japanese blood who served the enemy. Yet even he delivered commands without cruelty. The machinery of captivity seemed designed not to break them, but simply to contain them. Takeshi watched for the trap. There had to be a trap. Perhaps the Americans were fattening them for propaganda photographs, to show the world how humane they were before the real torture began. Or perhaps they were gathering intelligence, waiting for one of the prisoners to crack and reveal military secrets. But weeks passed, and no interrogations came, no cameras, no demands for confessions, just the steady, monotonous rhythm of captivity. The psychological weight was worse than any physical pain. Takeshi had been trained to endure suffering. Pain could be borne, hunger could be borne. But this perverse kindness, this refusal to fulfill the propaganda's promises, left him adrift. He had built his identity on the certainty that surrender meant death, and death meant honor preserved. Instead, he lived, dishonored, his existence a daily contradiction he could not reconcile. Some of the other prisoners adapted more quickly. A corporal named Sato began teaching himself English, listening carefully when the guards spoke, and repeating words under his breath. A private named Watanabe started sketching in the dirt, recreating images of home. These men had found ways to exist within the contradiction. Takeshi envied and despised them in equal measure. To adapt felt like acceptance. To accept felt like another betrayal. At night, lying on his bunk, Takeshi thought of his family. His father had been a school teacher, a man of quiet discipline who spoke often of duty and sacrifice. His mother had sent him off to war with a 1,000-stitch belt, a senibari, embroidered by women of the village for protection. He had worn it into battle, believing it carried their prayers. When the shrapnel struck, the belt had offered no protection. It was gone, now, lost somewhere in the chaos of capture, another severed connection to the life he would never return to. He thought of his younger brother, still training at a military academy, still innocent of the war's true face. Would his brother be told that Takeshi died honorably? Or would the truth emerge, that he had been captured, that he had become the worst thing a Japanese soldier could be, a prisoner? The shame would stain the family for generations. His brother might never be promoted. His sister might never find a husband willing to marry into a family marked by dishonor. The Americans seemed oblivious to these internal agonies. To them, the prisoners were simply men to be fed, housed, and guarded until the war ended and some political decision determined their fate. They did not understand that to a Japanese soldier, survival as a captive was not mercy, it was a sentence worse than death. The barbed wire did not merely contain their bodies. It trapped them in a liminal space between the warrior code that defined them and a reality that defied it. Takeshi began to count the days, marking them mentally as a way to impose order on the chaos of his existence. 1 month, 2 months, summer's brutal heat gave way to autumn's cooler winds. The camp remained the same: work details, rations, roll call. The Americans remained consistent, neither cruel nor kind, simply efficient. It was this efficiency, this bureaucratic indifference, that finally began to crack something in Takeshi's understanding. They did not see him as a monster to be destroyed. They saw him as a problem to be managed. And in that recognition, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but a faint, terrifying possibility that perhaps the propaganda had lied. Perhaps the Americans were not the demons he had been taught to fear. Perhaps his capture was not the end of honor, but something else entirely, something he did not yet have words to name. Then, on a grey October afternoon, the camp commandant made an announcement. The prisoners were assembled in the yard, standing in uneven rows, their faces a mixture of suspicion and resignation. An interpreter stepped forward, a young Nisei corporal whose Japanese was formal and precise. "You will be given recreational time," the interpreter said. "The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners of war be allowed physical exercise and leisure activities. Equipment will be provided." Takeshi did not understand. Recreation? They were prisoners, enemies, men who had killed Americans in battle. Why would their captors concern themselves with recreation? The interpreter must have seen the confusion on their faces because he continued, his voice careful. "This is not a reward. It is international law. You will be given access to sports equipment. You may organize games if you wish." Sports equipment. The words felt absurd, disconnected from everything Takeshi knew about captivity. He glanced at the other prisoners. Some looked as bewildered as he felt. Others wore expressions of deep suspicion. This had to be a trick. Perhaps they would be forced to perform for cameras, to demonstrate their subservience for propaganda purposes. Or perhaps it was a test, a way to identify which prisoners retained fighting spirit. The following day, crates arrived at the camp's central yard. American guards pried them open with crowbars, the wood splintering loudly in the quiet morning. Takeshi watched from a distance, his body tense. What lay inside? Instruments of humiliation? Tools for forced labor? The guards stepped back, gesturing for the prisoners to approach. No one moved. 43 men stood frozen, unable to reconcile the invitation with their expectations. Finally, Sato, the corporal who had been learning English, stepped forward. His hands were trembling, but he walked to the crates and looked inside. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached in and lifted something into the light. A baseball glove. The leather was worn but intact, the pocket shaped by use. Sato stared at it as if it were a religious artifact, his face struggling to process what he held. He reached into the crate again. Another glove. Then a ball, white with red stitching, then a wooden bat, its surface smooth and solid. Sato's hands shook as he set the items on the ground, then reached for more. By the time he finished, a small pile of equipment lay in the Oklahoma dust. 4 gloves, 2 bats, 3 balls, simple objects. Objects that carried no violence, no cruelty, only the possibility of a game. Takeshi felt something crack inside his chest. It was not a relief. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing on ground that suddenly refused to stay solid. He had been waiting for torture, for starvation, for execution. Instead, he had been given a baseball glove. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The prisoners stood motionless, staring at the equipment as if it might explode. No one spoke. The guards watched, their expressions unreadable. Minutes stretched. Then one of the younger prisoners, a private named Tanaka, laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, somewhere between hysteria and disbelief. He walked to the pile, picked up a ball, and turned it over in his hands. His eyes were wet. "They gave us baseball gloves," he said in Japanese, his voice hollow. "They defeated us, captured us, brought us across the ocean, and they gave us baseball gloves." The irony was almost unbearable. In Japan, before the war consumed everything, Takeshi had played baseball. It had been a beloved sport, imported from America decades earlier, embraced by schools and factories and military units. He had played in his youth, back when the world still made sense. But when the war began, the government had declared baseball an enemy sport, contaminated by its American origins. Players were forbidden from using English terms. Strike became yoshi. Safe became yosh. The sport itself became a casualty of ideology. And now, here, behind barbed wire, in the heart of enemy territory, they were being handed the tools to play it again. Another prisoner stepped forward, then another. Slowly, cautiously, they approached the equipment. Hands reached out, touched leather, gripped wood. The objects were real. They were solid. They were impossibly, incomprehensibly kind. Takeshi watched as Watanabe picked up a glove and slipped his hand inside, flexing his fingers against the worn padding. A smile flickered across his face, brief and fragile, before shame chased it away. To smile felt like a betrayal of the dead. But the glove remained in his hand. The guards began setting up a makeshift field in the yard, pacing off distances, marking bases with stones. They worked with the same bureaucratic efficiency they brought to everything, following orders without emotion. When they finished, one of them gestured toward the equipment, then toward the field. The message was clear: play if you want. For a long time, no one moved. The prisoners stood clustered around the equipment, caught between desire and duty, between the memory of who they had been and the crushing reality of who they were now. Finally, Sato, the corporal who had opened the crates, picked up a ball and a glove. He walked to the center of the makeshift field and looked back at the others. "We are already dishonored," he said quietly in Japanese. "What harm can come from this?" It was permission. It was an absolution. It was the thinnest possible justification for doing something that felt human in a place designed to strip humanity away. Another prisoner, a sergeant named Fujita, picked up the second glove and joined him. They stood 20 paces apart. Sato tossed the ball. Fujita caught it. The sound of leather meeting leather was soft, almost gentle. They began to throw. Back and forth, the ball travelled, a simple rhythm that required no language, no ideology, just the physical memory of a game they had played in another life. More prisoners joined. Someone picked up a bat, testing its weight, remembering the stance. The field took shape without discussion. Prisoners moving to positions they had once held on school teams, in factory leagues, in military units, before the war turned everything to ash. Takeshi stood at the edge, watching. He could not bring himself to join. It felt too much like forgiveness, too much like accepting captivity as something other than the living death it was supposed to be. But he watched, and in watching, he felt the crack inside his chest widen. The game was slow, informal, more practice than competition. No one kept score. They simply moved through the motions, remembering what it felt like to swing a bat, to field a grounder, to run. The Americans watched from the perimeter, their rifles still slung over their shoulders, but their postures relaxed. One guard, a tall man with sunburned skin, smiled slightly. Another nodded approval when Fujita made a particularly good catch. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the field, Takeshi felt tears sting his eyes. He did not wipe them away. He stood alone at the edge of the makeshift diamond and wept for reasons he could not name. Shame, grief, relief, confusion. All of it tangled together, too complex to separate. Someone called him in Japanese. "Yamamoto, we need another player." He looked up. Sato stood at third base, waving him over. The invitation hung in the air, impossible and undeniable. Takeshi thought of his father, his mother, his brother. He thought of the Senjin-kun, the code that had promised death before dishonor. He thought of the propaganda posters, the promises of torture and degradation. Then he thought of the baseball glove lying in the dust, worn and waiting. He walked to the pile of equipment and picked up the remaining glove. It fit his hand as if it had been waiting for him. He joined the others on the field, taking a position near second base. The ball came toward him, and instinct took over. He caught it cleanly, the impact solid against his palm. He threw it to first base, completing the play. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than shame. It was not happiness. It was not redemption. But it was human. And in a place where humanity had seemed impossible, that was enough. The baseball games became a rhythm within the rhythm of captivity. 3 times a week, weather permitting, the prisoners were allowed access to the equipment. What had begun as tentative, almost guilty participation evolved into something deeper. Men who had not spoken to each other in weeks found themselves coordinating plays, calling out positions in Japanese, arguing good-naturedly about whether a runner was safe or out. Takeshi played because he could not play. The alternative was to sit alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts had become unbearable company. On the field, his mind quieted. His body remembered patterns older than the war, muscle memory from a life that felt impossibly distant. When he caught a line drive, the satisfaction was brief but real. When he struck out, the disappointment was clean, uncomplicated by ideology or shame. Baseball offered something war had taken away, moments that simply were, without layers of meaning crushing them into symbols. The Americans continued their efficient, impersonal management of the camp. Guards rotated shifts, meals arrived on schedule, work details were assigned, but something had shifted in the way they watched the games. Some guards lingered, leaning against fence posts, observing with what looked like approval. One afternoon, a guard tossed a ball back when it rolled beyond the makeshift outfield, a gesture so casual it seemed almost friendly. The prisoners froze, uncertain how to interpret it. The guard simply returned to his post. Winter came early to Oklahoma that year. By late November, the temperature dropped sharply, frost whitening the ground each morning. The baseball equipment was stored away, and the prisoners retreated into the barracks, where a single pot-belly stove struggled to heat the space. Men huddled in their bunks, wrapped in wool blankets, breathing clouds of vapor into the cold air. The monotony of winter wore on them differently than summer had. In the heat, there had been work to exhaust the body and games to occupy the mind. Now there was only waiting for spring, waiting for the war to end, waiting for someone to decide their fate. Rumors circulated about the war's progress, fragments gleaned from careless guard conversations or glimpses of newspapers. Germany was faltering. Japan was being pushed back across the Pacific. The war that had seemed eternal was approaching some kind of conclusion. Takeshi felt the approach of the end with a mixture of dread and confusion. When the war ended, what would happen to them? Would they be repatriated to a Japan that no longer wanted them? Would they be tried as war criminals? Or would they simply be forgotten, left to rot behind wire until they became ghosts in truth as well as spirit? On a bitter December morning, 2 weeks before Christmas, a truck arrived at the camp. This was not unusual. Trucks brought supplies regularly, food and medicine and equipment. But this truck was different. It carried crates stamped with logos the prisoners did not recognize, bright colors and English words that meant nothing to them. The guards unloaded the crates into the mess hall, working quickly in the cold. That evening, at dinner, something changed. The meal began as usual. Prisoners filed through the serving line, accepting their portions with the silent efficiency of men who had learned not to expect surprises. But when Takeshi reached the front of the line, the cook, a thick-armed American, with flour perpetually dusting his apron, placed something unexpected on his tray: a hamburger. Takeshi stared at it. He had seen hamburgers in propaganda films before the war, depicted as symbols of American decadence, grotesque excesses of a culture that valued pleasure over discipline. The reality before him looked nothing like those caricatures. It was simply food, a patty of meat on a bun, steam rising from its surface. Beside the hamburger, the cook placed something else: a bottle, green glass with a distinctive curved shape, filled with dark liquid, Coca-Cola. Takeshi knew the name. Before the war, it had been available in some Japanese cities, a foreign curiosity. Then it had been banned, labelled an enemy product, contaminated by American capitalism. And now here it was, cold and beaded with condensation, sitting on his tray. He carried his meal to a table in a daze. Around him, other prisoners experienced the same shocked silence. 43 men sat staring at hamburgers and Coca-Cola bottles, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught to expect. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else whispered a prayer. Takeshi simply stared. The propaganda had promised torture. It had promised starvation, degradation, death. Instead, they had been given baseball gloves and Coca-Cola. The dissonance was so profound it felt physically painful, as if his mind was tearing itself apart, trying to hold two incompatible truths simultaneously. Sato, sitting across from Takeshi, picked up his bottle. He examined it closely, turning it in his hands, reading the English letters embossed on the glass. Then, slowly, he brought it to his lips and drank. His eyes widened. He lowered the bottle and stared at it with an expression of wonder and grief. "It tastes like before," he whispered in Japanese, "like Tokyo before the war." The words broke something. Around the mess hall, prisoners began to eat. Some approached the food cautiously, as if it might be poisoned. Others ate quickly, hungrily, as if trying to consume the kindness before it could be withdrawn. Takeshi bit into the hamburger. The meat was warm, seasoned with salt and pepper, cooked thoroughly. It tasted nothing like the field rations he had survived on during the war's final months. It tasted, impossibly, like someone had cared enough to cook it properly. He drank Coca-Cola. The sweetness was shocking after months of bland prison food, the carbonation sharp against his tongue. He remembered drinking Coca-Cola once, years ago, at a festival in Osaka. He had been young then, unaware that war was coming, that he would one day sit behind barbed wire in Oklahoma, weeping quietly into a bottle because the enemy had fed him better than his own army ever had. That night, back in the barracks, the prisoners talked. For the first time since their capture, they talked openly, voices rising above whispers, discussing what they had experienced. The conversations were fractured, confused, men trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. "They are softening us," Fujita said, his voice hard, "making us weak so we forget who we are. Or they are following their laws," Sato countered. "The Geneva Convention requires adequate food, but hamburgers?" Someone else interjected. "Coca-Cola? That is not adequate. That is abundance." Takeshi listened without speaking. He lay on his bunk, hands folded across his chest, staring at the ceiling. The taste of Coca-Cola still lingered on his tongue, sweet and impossible. He thought about the propaganda films, the posters, the radio broadcasts. Every single one had lied. Not exaggerated, not misinterpreted. Lied. The Americans were not monsters. They were not torturers. They were, in fact, treating their prisoners better than Japan had treated its own soldiers in the final desperate months of the war. Takeshi remembered the hunger on Saipan, the way officers hoarded rice while enlisted men starved. He remembered watching men die not from American bullets but from dysentery and malnutrition, their bodies too weak to fight infections. He remembered being told that suffering was honorable, that to complain was to betray the emperor. And now, captured by the enemy, he had eaten the best meal of his military service. The realization was devastating. It meant everything he had believed, everything he had sacrificed for, was built on lies. The emperor had not protected them. The military had not valued them. The code of honor that demanded death over capture had been designed not to preserve dignity, but to prevent soldiers from discovering what Takeshi now knew: that the enemy might be more humane than the nation they served. He wept then, silently, his face turned toward the wall so others would not see. He wept for the men who had died believing the lies. He wept for his family, still trapped in those lies. He wept for himself, for the loss of certainty, for the terrible freedom of discovering that everything he had built his identity upon was false. Days passed. The good food continued. Hamburgers appeared regularly. Coca-Cola was distributed with meals. The prisoners' bodies began to change. Ribs that had shown through skin became hidden beneath muscle. Faces that had been gaunt filled out. Energy returned. Men who had moved slowly, conserving strength, began to walk with something like purpose. But the psychological transformation was more profound than the physical one. The cognitive dissonance created by kindness from an expected enemy forced a reckoning. Some prisoners, like Fujita, retreated further into ideology, insisting this was all propaganda, all manipulation. They ate the food, but refused to acknowledge what it meant. Others, like Sato, began to openly question what they had been taught. If they lied about this, Sato said one evening, what else was a lie? It was a dangerous question, one that opened doors no one was certain they wanted to walk through. But once asked, it could not be unasked. Men began to share stories they had kept silent. A private admitted he had seen Japanese officers execute wounded soldiers rather than let them be captured. Another described watching civilians on Saipan throw themselves from cliffs, choosing death over what they believed would be torture from advancing Americans. These stories had once seemed like examples of honor and loyalty. Now, in the light of hamburgers and Coca-Cola, they looked like tragedies born from lies. Takeshi found himself at the center of this transformation, though he spoke little. Other prisoners watched him, perhaps because he had been so resistant at first, so locked in shame. When he finally began to play baseball, others followed. When he accepted the food without protest, others did the same. He had not sought this role, but war creates strange hierarchies, and somehow he had become a barometer for collective feeling. One frozen January afternoon, a guard approached Takeshi during a work detail. The man was young, probably no older than 22, with red hair and freckles dusting his pale skin. He gestured for Takeshi to stop working, then pulled something from his pocket. A chocolate bar. The guard held it out, not as a command, but as an offer. Takeshi stared at it, then at the guard's face. The young American looked uncomfortable, as if he knew the gesture was inadequate but felt compelled to make it anyway. Takeshi took the chocolate. The guard nodded once, then walked away. Takeshi stood holding the chocolate bar, feeling its weight in his palm. It was a Hershey bar, the wrapper printed with English words he could not read. He unwrapped it slowly, broke off a piece, placed it on his tongue. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw Sato watching him from a few yards away. The corporal walked over, his breath clouding in the cold air. "They are not what we were told," Sato said quietly. "No," Takeshi agreed. "They are not. Then what do we do with that knowledge?" It was the question that haunted all of them. To accept that the Americans were not monsters meant accepting that Japan had sent them to war based on lies. It meant confronting the possibility that their sacrifices, their suffering, their honor had been spent in service of propaganda rather than truth. Some men could not bear that weight. They retreated into silence, into rigid adherence to the old codes, because the alternative was unbearable. But Takeshi found he could not retreat. The crack that had opened inside him on the day of the baseball gloves had widened into something he could no longer ignore. He had spent his adult life believing in certainties, the emperor's divinity, the righteousness of Japan's cause, the subhuman nature of the enemy. Every single certainty had been revealed as fiction. What remained was something more fragile but perhaps more real. He was alive. He had been treated with a baseline humanity that his own nation had denied him, and he would have to decide what to do with that truth. Winter gave way to a hesitant spring. The baseball equipment emerged from storage. Prisoners returned to the makeshift field, their bodies stronger now, their movements more confident. The games took on a different quality. Men smiled occasionally, laughed at mistakes, celebrated good plays. The guilt did not disappear, but it became possible to exist alongside it rather than being consumed by it. On a warm April morning, news filtered through the camp. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners absorbed this information in silence. Japan stood alone now, facing the combined might of the Allies. Some prisoners clung to hope that their nation would fight to the last man, achieving a glorious defeat. Others privately understood that the end was approaching and that it would not be glorious. Takeshi felt a strange numbness when he heard the news. He should have felt despair, but instead felt only a distant sadness, as if Germany's surrender was happening in another world that barely touched his own. His world had shrunk to this camp, these men, these impossible contradictions of captivity. In early August, something shifted in the guards' behavior. They became more agitated, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Trucks arrived and departed with unusual frequency. Then, on August 6th, a guard called for the interpreter. The Nisei corporal gathered the prisoners in the yard, his face grave. "A new weapon has been used against Japan," the interpreter said in careful Japanese. "A single bomb destroyed the city of Hiroshima. The casualties are believed to be enormous." Silence. Then someone asked, "How is that possible?" "One bomb." The interpreter shook his head. "I do not know the details, only that it is a new type of weapon, more powerful than anything before." The prisoners dispersed slowly, stunned. Takeshi tried to imagine a bomb that could destroy an entire city. His mind could not grasp it. He thought of Hiroshima, a place he had never visited but knew existed, full of people, families, children, all gone in an instant. The scale of it was incomprehensible. 3 days later, the interpreter returned. Another bomb had been dropped, this time on Nagasaki. The prisoners learned this news with hollow eyes. Some wept, some raged, some simply stood motionless, unable to process the enormity of what was happening. On August 15, 1945, the war ended. The announcement came through the camp's loudspeakers, first in English, then translated into Japanese by the interpreter. Emperor Hirohito had addressed the nation by radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. Japan had lost. For Takeshi, the news arrived like a wave he had seen coming from a great distance, but still could not prepare for. He sat on his bunk, hands trembling, trying to understand what this meant. The war he had fought in, believed in, sacrificed for, was over. And Japan had lost. Everything, the battles, the suffering, the deaths, all of it had been for nothing. Around him, prisoners reacted in different ways. Some collapsed in grief, sobbing into their blankets. Others sat rigid, faces blank with shock. Fujita, the sergeant who had insisted the Americans' kindness was manipulation, walked out to the fence and stood there for hours, staring at nothing. When guards tried to move him, he refused. He simply stood, frozen, a man who had lost the only certainty that had sustained him. The days following the announcement were surreal. The war was over, but the prisoners remained prisoners. They waited to learn their fate, suspended in yet another limbo. Would they be returned to Japan? Kept in America? Punished for their service? No one knew. The guards seemed as uncertain as the prisoners, following routines out of habit rather than purpose. Then, on a bright September morning, the commandant addressed them through the interpreter. "You will be repatriated," the interpreter said. "Ships are being prepared. Within months, you will return to Japan." Return to Japan. The words should have brought joy, but Takeshi felt only apprehension. What Japan would they return to? A nation destroyed by fire and atomic bombs? A nation that had abandoned them in captivity? A nation that still believed surrender was the greatest shame? He thought of his family, if they still lived. He thought of facing his father, explaining how he had survived as a prisoner. The shame he had carried since capture had not vanished with the war's end. If anything, it had deepened, because now he would have to carry it home. But something else had also taken root during his time behind wire, a truth he could not unlearn. The enemy had been more humane than his own nation. The propaganda had been lies, and he had survived not through honor, but through the unexpected mercy of men he had been taught to hate. On one of the last days before deportation, the Pernit prisoners were given a final meal, hamburgers and Coca-Cola, just as before. Takeshi ate slowly, savoring the taste, knowing he would likely never experience it again. Around him, prisoners ate in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. After the meal, Sato approached Takeshi. The corporal held something in his hands, wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing one of the baseball gloves. "I asked if I could keep it," Sato said quietly. They said yes. Takeshi looked at the worn leather, remembering the first time he had seen it, lying in the Oklahoma dust. So much had changed since that day. He had changed. The war had ended, not with glory but with surrender and atomic fire. And somehow, in the midst of all that destruction, he had been given a baseball glove and a bottle of Coca-Cola, and those small kindnesses had done what torture could never have accomplished. They had broken through the propaganda and shown him the truth. "What will you tell people?" Takeshi asked. "When will you return home?" Sato looked at the glove, running his fingers across the stitching. "The truth," he said finally, "that we were captured, that we expected to die, and that the enemy gave us baseball gloves instead. They will not believe you." "Perhaps not, but it is still the truth." The ships came in October. Prisoners were loaded aboard, their few possessions clutched in makeshift bags. Takeshi stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the American coast, watching the land recede into the distance. Somewhere back there, behind wire that no longer held him, was a baseball field where he had remembered what it felt like to be human. The voyage across the Pacific was long and difficult. The prisoners were crammed into holds, the conditions barely better than the journey that had brought them to America, But this time, they were going home, whatever that meant now. When they finally arrived in Japan, the devastation was worse than anything Takeshi had imagined. Cities reduced to rubble, populations starving, a nation defeated so thoroughly that even the most fervent militarists had fallen silent. He stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil and felt nothing like the joy he had expected, only a profound, hollow grief. The repatriation process was bureaucratic and cold. Prisoners were processed, their names recorded, their stories catalogued in official reports that few would ever read. Takeshi was assigned to a transit camp where he would wait until transportation to his home prefecture could be arranged. The camp was nothing like the one in Oklahoma. Food was scarce, shelter was minimal. The Japanese officials processing them treated the returned prisoners with barely concealed contempt. These men had surrendered. They had lived. They were stains on the national honor. Takeshi endured their disdain in silence. He had learned something during his captivity that these officials had not. That survival was not shameful. That life had value beyond propaganda and codes of honor. That kindness could come from unexpected places, even from an enemy. When he finally reached his family's village, he found it half destroyed by American firebombing. His parents' house still stood, damaged but intact. His mother answered the door, her face aged beyond recognition by grief and malnutrition. When she saw him, she collapsed, weeping. His father stood behind her, silent, his expression unreadable. That night, sitting around a meager meal of rice and pickles, Takeshi tried to explain. He spoke haltingly about his capture, his imprisonment, the baseball gloves, and Coca-Cola. His parents listened in silence. When he finished, his father looked at him for a long moment. "You should have died," his father said quietly. The words cut deeper than any American weapon ever had. Takeshi nodded, accepting the judgment. But inside, in a place his father could never reach, he held on to a different truth. He had lived. He had been shown mercy. And that mercy had revealed the lies they all had built their lives upon. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes. Democracy replaced empire. Baseball returned, no longer an enemy sport but a national passion. Takeshi married, had children, worked in a factory that produced electronics for export. He lived an ordinary life, unremarkable to outside observers. But sometimes, on warm summer evenings, he would listen to baseball games on the radio. The crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd, the announcer's excited voice would transport him back to an Oklahoma field, to the moment when an enemy had handed him a glove and invited him to play. In those moments, he remembered what it had felt like to discover that the world was not what he had been taught. His children grew up in a different Japan, one that had learned different lessons from the war. They knew nothing of the Senjin-kun, nothing of the propaganda that had told their father to choose death over surrender. Sometimes Takeshi would start to tell them about his war experience, then fall silent. How could he explain what he had lived through? The shame, the confusion, the terrible gift of enemy kindness? In his old age, historians began to seek him out. Japan had started confronting its wartime past, collecting testimonies from veterans and survivors. Takeshi agreed to be interviewed, though he knew his story would make many uncomfortable. He described the capture, the camp, the baseball gloves. He described the hamburgers and Coca-Cola, the way the Americans had followed the Geneva Convention even when Japan had not. The historians listened, took notes, recorded his words. Some seemed skeptical, as if they doubted an enemy could have shown such humanity. But Takeshi had the evidence of his own survival. He had lived when he expected to die. He had been treated with dignity when he expected degradation, and those experiences had taught him something his nation's militarists had tried to hide. That honor was not found in death, but in how one chose to live, that enemies could be more merciful than friends, that small acts of kindness, a baseball glove, a bottle of Coca-Cola, could shatter propaganda more effectively than any weapon. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.